The aroma of grilled onions and sizzling beef filled the morning air as Maria Santos adjusted the flame under her portable grill. Her weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, flipping patties and arranging fresh vegetables on the cramped counter of her food truck. Elena's kitchen. The diplomatic quarter of Geneva buzzed with early morning activity as black sedans and security details prepared for another day of the International Security Summit. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "Excuse me, lady," barked Ambassador Richard Thornfield, his British accent dripping with condescension as he knocked impatiently on the service window. "We need this entire block cleared by noon. The real delegates don't want street vendors cluttering up the area when the photographers arrive." Maria looked up from her prep work, her dark eyes meeting his through the service window. At 52, she had learned to read people quickly, their tells, their weaknesses, their assumptions. Thornfield stood there in his $1,000 suit, flanked by two younger diplomats who smirked behind him like schoolyard bullies. "I have permits," Maria replied quietly in accented English, wiping her hands on her apron. "Paid for 6 months. Of this spot." Thornfield laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "Permits? Listen, sweetheart, this isn't some street fair. We're conducting business that affects global security while you're here serving. What do you call these things?" He gestured dismissively at her menu board. "Tacos to tourists?" The younger diplomats erupted in laughter. One of them, a sharp-faced man with perfectly styled hair, pulled out his phone and started recording. "This is perfect," he said loudly. Local color trying to lecture actual diplomats about permits. Maria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For just a moment, her fingers brushed against the small scar on her wrist, a reminder of another life, another time when men in expensive suits had underestimated her. But that was 15 years ago, in a different world where she went by a different name. "Move along, Maria," Thornfield said, reading her name from the faded permit taped to her window. "Leave the important work to the important people." The woman they dismissed as just another immigrant food vendor stood motionless as the diplomats walked away, their laughter echoing off the pristine buildings of the diplomatic quarter. None of them noticed how her eyes tracked their movements with surgical precision, or how her seemingly casual glance took inventory of their security details, communication devices, and behavioral patterns. They saw what they wanted to see, an aging woman in a stained apron, irrelevant to their world of international power plays. What they didn't see was Elena Vasquez, former intelligence operative for the Spanish National Intelligence Center, one of Europe's most decorated undercover agents who had spent 2 decades infiltrating terrorist cells, drug cartels, and rogue governments across 3 continents. The woman who had successfully maintained deep cover identities in Beirut, Bangkok, and Buenos Aires. The operative who had once spent 18 months as a seamstress in a Karachi marketplace to track down arms dealers, and another 2 years as a nightclub singer in Moscow to identify double agents. Maria Santos was just her latest role, and perhaps her most carefully constructed one. The transformation from Elena Vasquez to Maria Santos had begun 3 years earlier in a nondescript office building in Madrid. Elena sat across from director Carlos Mendoza, her handler of 12 years, as he slid a thick folder across the mahogany table. Her operational record was impressive: 47 successful missions, 0 blown covers, and a reputation among intelligence communities as the woman who could disappear into any culture, any profession, any life. "We need someone invisible," Mendoza had explained, his weathered face serious. "Someone who can get close to targets that have become impossible to reach through traditional channels." The food service industry provides perfect covermobile, cash-based, minimal background checks required. Elena had studied the mission parameters with the analytical mind that had kept her alive through countless operations. A network of international arms dealers had evolved beyond government reach, operating at the highest levels of diplomacy and international business. They moved through protected spaces, embassies, diplomatic summits, international conferences, places where traditional surveillance was impossible and conventional agents couldn't penetrate. "They're planning something big," Mendoza continued. "Our intelligence suggests they're using legitimate diplomatic gatherings to coordinate arms sales to multiple terrorist organizations. We need someone who can get close without triggering their security protocols." The genius of the food truck operation lay in its invisibility. Diplomats and security personnel were trained to watch for threats that looked like threats: suspicious individuals, unusual behavior, potential weapons. They weren't trained to see danger in the middle-aged woman who served their coffee each morning, who remembered their usual orders, who chatted pleasantly about the weather while she prepared their sandwiches. Elena had spent 6 months learning the food service trade in Barcelona, working under an assumed name in tapas bars and street kitchens. She studied not just cooking techniques but the rhythm of service work, the physical toll it took on the body, the way chronic fatigue settled into the posture of someone who stood on their feet 14 hours a day. She practiced accents and mannerisms, building a complete identity that would hold up under scrutiny. The Maria Santos identity came complete with fabricated employment history, manufactured health records, and carefully placed references who would vouch for her character if anyone bothered to check. She was a widow from Barcelona whose husband had died in a construction accident, forcing her to support herself through food service work. She had no children, few friends, and the kind of unremarkable life story that made people's eyes glaze over when she told it. Geneva had been chosen for the long-term operation because of its concentration of international organizations and regular diplomatic traffic. The International Security Summit happened twice yearly, bringing together exactly the kind of high-value targets Elena needed to access. She spent months establishing herself in the local community, building relationships with suppliers, customers, and other vendors who would provide authentic cover for her presence. The first year was devoted entirely to establishing credibility. Elena worked 16-hour days, perfecting Maria's cooking, learning the seasonal rhythms of the diplomatic calendar, and mapping the security protocols of various international organizations. She developed regular customers among the support staff of embassies and international agencies, translators, security guards, administrative assistants who saw her as a friendly face in their demanding work environment. Her food truck, Elena's Kitchen, became a fixture in the area. The name was a calculated choice. Using her real first name made it easier to respond naturally when called, while the possessive suggested the kind of personal pride that would explain her dedication to the business. She served simple, good food at reasonable prices, exactly what busy diplomatic workers needed and appreciated. The second year brought her first intelligence victories. As trust built with her regular customers, conversations became more open. Administrative staff complained about their demanding bosses. Security guards mentioned unusual protocols being implemented. Translators gossiped about tensions between different delegations. Elena listened with the practiced ear of someone trained in intelligence gathering, filing away seemingly innocent details that formed patterns when analyzed collectively. She began identifying members of the arms-dealing network through careful observation and social engineering. A secretary who always ordered extra coffee when certain meetings ran long. A security detail that followed predictable patterns, except when specific individuals were present. Financial attaches who paid for meals with cash that looked suspiciously new and sequential. The breakthrough came during her second International Security Summit when Elena noticed a pattern in catering requests. Certain diplomatic delegations consistently requested private catering services for cultural appreciation events that coincided with arms sale activity in various global hotspots. The same catering company was used repeatedly, despite their prices being significantly higher than competitors. Elena spent weeks researching the catering company, eventually discovering it was a front operation owned by shell companies that traced back to known arms dealers. The cultural events were actually coordination meetings where weapons sales were negotiated under the cover of diplomatic immunity. The genius of the operation was that the meetings appeared completely legitimate cultural exchange programs, were common among diplomatic missions, and generated no suspicion from security services. By the third year, Elena had identified 17 members of the arms-dealing network and mapped their communication patterns, financial structures, and operational methods. She had documented evidence of weapons sales to 6 different terrorist organizations and 3 rogue governments. The network was more extensive than original intelligence had suggested, with connections reaching into legitimate defense contractors, international banks, and government agencies across 4 continents. The challenge was that traditional law enforcement approaches were impossible. The arms dealers operated under diplomatic cover, moved through protected spaces, and had been careful to structure their activities in ways that avoided breaking laws in any single jurisdiction. They exploited gaps between international legal systems and leveraged diplomatic immunity to stay beyond the reach of conventional justice. Director Mendoza visited Geneva personally to review Elena's intelligence and plan the final phase of the operation. They met in a small cafe far from the diplomatic quarter, 2 middle-aged professionals discussing what appeared to be a routine business matter. "The evidence is solid," Mendoza acknowledged after reviewing her reports. "But prosecution will be impossible through normal channels. Too many diplomatic complications, too many jurisdictional issues." Elena had expected this conclusion. In her years of intelligence work, she had learned that the most dangerous criminals often operated in legal gray areas where traditional justice couldn't reach them. Sometimes direct action was the only viable solution. "What are you suggesting?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. "Now back to the story," she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Permanent disruption of their operations," Mendoza replied carefully. "The Spring Security Summit next month will bring all the key players together in one location. They're planning a major coordination meeting. Our intelligence suggests they're organizing simultaneous arms sales to multiple terrorist groups, including chemical weapons components." The scope of the threat was staggering. The weapons being coordinated through the network would fuel conflicts across the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Hundreds of thousands of lives hung in the balance, with the potential for chemical attacks on civilian populations if the sales were completed. Elena understood the weight of what was being asked. This wasn't a conventional mission with extraction plans and backup support. This was a termination operation that would end her career as an intelligence operative and require her to disappear permanently afterward. Once Maria Santos made her move, Elena Vasquez could never exist again. "I'll need complete operational independence," she said finally. "No communications, no oversight, no extraction support." Mendoza nodded grimly. "Understood. You'll be completely on your own." The planning phase was meticulous and solitary. Elena couldn't risk any communications with her handlers or support staff that might compromise the operation. She studied the target list repeatedly, memorizing faces, backgrounds, and behavioral patterns. She researched their food preferences, dietary restrictions, and cultural sensitivities that would inform her approach. The weapon of choice was ricin, a naturally occurring toxin that could be extracted from castor beans and delivered through food with minimal detection risk. Elena had used ricin in previous operations because of its delayed action symptoms typically didn't appear for several hours, giving her time to complete the entire operation before anyone realized what was happening. She spent weeks perfecting the extraction and preparation process, working in the small kitchen behind her food truck during the early morning hours when the area was deserted. The ricin was colorless, nearly tasteless, and stable when mixed with strong flavors and spices. Her signature breakfast burritos, with their complex blend of peppers and seasonings, provided perfect camouflage for the toxin, the psychological. Preparation was perhaps more challenging than the technical aspects. Elena had killed before in the line of duty, but always in direct confrontation situations where her own life was threatened. This operation required her to smile pleasantly at 50 people while knowingly serving them their last meal. The mental compartmentalization necessary for such an act pushed even her experienced psyche to its limits. She reminded herself of the intelligence reports detailing the network's planned sales, chemical weapons components destined for terrorist groups in Syria, advanced explosives heading to insurgents in Yemen, anti-aircraft missiles being shipped to drug cartels in Colombia. The blood that would be on her hands if she failed far exceeded what would be on them if she succeeded. The Spring Security Summit began on a crisp morning in April. Elena arrived at her usual spot before dawn, going through her normal preparation routine while internally reviewing every detail of the operation. The breakfast rush would begin at 7, when support staff and security personnel sought their usual coffee and food before the day's meetings began. At exactly 7:15, she began serving the poisoned food. Ambassador Thornfield was her third customer, ordering his usual breakfast burrito with extra hot sauce. "Morning, Maria," he said with the kind of casual dismissiveness she had grown accustomed to. "Big day today. Try not to get in the way of anything important." Elena smiled pleasantly as she handed him the wrapped burrito. "Of course, sir. Enjoy your meeting." She served each target with the same professional courtesy she had maintained for 3 years, watching as they walked away carrying the instruments of their own destruction. Arms dealers disguised as cultural attaches, weapons, brokers posing as trade representatives, money launderers masquerading as diplomatic security. By noon, she had successfully delivered poisoned food to all 50 identified targets. The ricin would begin taking effect within 4 to 6 hours, causing initially mild symptoms that would rapidly progress to organ failure. The delayed action was crucial. It would appear that all the victims had suffered simultaneous food poisoning, a tragic accident rather than a coordinated assassination. Elena spent the afternoon maintaining her normal routine, serving regular customers and preparing for the evening rush. Inside, she counted down the hours until the operation's success would become apparent. She felt no satisfaction or triumph, only the grim determination of a professional completing a necessary but unpleasant task. The first signs of success came at 4:30 when emergency vehicles began arriving at various embassy buildings and international organization headquarters throughout the diplomatic quarter. Initial reports described a widespread food poisoning incident affecting multiple diplomatic personnel who had eaten breakfast from various vendors in the area. By 6 o'clock, the scope of the crisis was becoming apparent to authorities. 50 diplomatic personnel from 17 different organizations were experiencing severe gastrointestinal symptoms. Hazmat teams were deployed to test food samples from every vendor in the diplomatic quarter. The entire area was placed under quarantine as medical teams worked to identify the source of what appeared to be a massive contamination event. Elena continued serving her regular evening customers, expressing appropriate concern about the health emergency while internally monitoring radio communications between security services. The investigation was focusing on possible bacterial contamination from a common food supplier, exactly as she had anticipated. The beauty of ricin as a weapon was that it left no obvious forensic signature. Food poisoning from bacterial contamination would produce similar symptoms, and the chaotic nature of a mass casualty event would make detailed forensic analysis of each case extremely difficult. By the time authorities realized they were dealing with intentional poisoning rather than accidental contamination. The evidence would be scattered across dozens of different medical facilities and jurisdiction. As night fell, Elena began her final preparations for disappearing. Maria Santos had served her purpose and would need to vanish completely to avoid investigation. Elena had prepared for this moment for months, establishing alternative identities and escape routes that would allow her to slip away undetected. The news reports that evening described a tragic outbreak of food poisoning that had affected dozens of diplomatic personnel attending the International Security Summit. Medical authorities were investigating possible bacterial contamination from commercial food suppliers, and several vendors in the diplomatic quarter had been temporarily shut down pending health inspections. What the reports didn't mention was that the arms-dealing network she had spent 3 years infiltrating had been completely eliminated. 50 key operatives were dead or dying, their coordination meetings would never happen, and the weapons sales they had planned would never be completed. The terrorist organizations expecting chemical weapons components would receive nothing. The rogue governments anticipating advanced missile systems would wait in vain. Elena packed her few personal belongings into a small backpack, leaving behind everything associated with Maria Santos. The food truck, her apartment, her carefully constructed identity, all of it would be abandoned as evidence of a life that had never really existed. She had done this before, walking away from elaborate covers that had taken years to build, leaving behind nothing but memories and mission reports. Her extraction route took her through back alleys and side streets, avoiding the emergency response personnel who flooded the diplomatic quarter. She moved with the purposeful pace of someone catching a late train, unremarkable in her traveling clothes and modest luggage. Within hours, she would be across the border using documentation that would never be connected to either Elena Vasquez or Maria Santos. The aftermath of the Geneva incident would be investigated for months by multiple international agencies. Health authorities would eventually conclude that bacterial contamination from an unknown source had caused the outbreak, though they would never identify exactly how or why it had affected such a specific group of diplomatic personnel. Security services would note the unusual targeting, but would lack sufficient evidence to prove intentional poisoning. The arms-dealing network would be reported in intelligence briefings as disrupted due to operational personnel losses, with new networks eventually forming to fill the void. But the immediate threat had been eliminated. The planned weapons sales had been prevented, and the lives that would have been lost to those weapons had been saved. Elena Vasquez disappeared into the anonymity of European train stations and border crossings, carrying with her the satisfaction of a mission completed and the weight of necessary choices made in service of a greater good. Somewhere behind her, in a small food truck that would soon be impounded as evidence, the remnants of Maria Santos's life bore witness to one of the most successful covert operations in modern intelligence history. The woman they had called Just, a food truck owner, had fed poison to 50 enemy agents at the summit, eliminating an international arms-dealing network while maintaining perfect operational security. She had proven once again that the most dangerous operatives are often those who appear completely harmless, and that the most effective weapons are sometimes served with a smile and a side of hot sauce. The weeks following the diplomatic quarter incident brought unprecedented scrutiny to every vendor, supplier, and service provider who had operated in the area. Elena watched from her small apartment as news crews interviewed health officials. Diplomatic security teams swept through every food establishment, and investigators collected samples from garbage bins and storage areas. The systematic investigation threatened to uncover details that could compromise her carefully constructed identity. Her apartment reflected the austere lifestyle of Maria Santos' second-hand furniture, basic cooking equipment, and the kind of modest possessions that suggested someone living paycheck to paycheck. But hidden behind a false panel in the bathroom wall lay Elena's real operational materials, encrypted communication devices, multiple sets of identification documents, and enough emergency cash to disappear instantly if her cover was blown. The morning news carried updates about the ongoing health investigation. Dr. Catherine Morrison, the lead epidemiologist, stood before a bank of microphones explaining their progress. We've identified bacterial contamination as the primary cause, but the specific pathogen remains elusive. Our teams are conducting comprehensive testing of all food vendors who operated in the diplomatic quarter during the relevant time frame. Elena recognized the careful language. Morrison was clearly frustrated by the investigation's lack of concrete findings, but public health officials couldn't admit they were dealing with something beyond their expertise. The symptoms had been consistent with severe food poisoning, but the simultaneous onset across multiple unconnected victims suggested a more complex cause that traditional bacterial testing couldn't identify. Her phone rang at 8 in the morning. An unknown local number that sent a chill down her spine. Elena had been expecting this call for days, knowing that eventually investigators would work through every food vendor in the area. "Miss Santos?" The voice was crisp and professional. "This is Inspector Laurent Dubois with the Geneva Health Authority. We need to schedule an interview regarding the recent health incident in the diplomatic quarter." Elena modulated her voice to convey the anxiety that Maria Santos would naturally feel in such circumstances. "Of course, Inspector. I want to help however I can. This has been very frightening for all of us vendors." "I'm sure it has been. Can you come to our offices this afternoon? Say 2 o'clock? The interview location was significant. Rather than visiting her food truck or apartment, they wanted her to come to them, a subtle form of intimidation designed to put subjects off balance. Elena agreed to the meeting, then spent the morning reviewing every detail of Maria's background story and preparing for intensive questioning. The Geneva Health Authority building was a sterile modern structure that housed the bureaucratic machinery of public health enforcement. Elena arrived early, presenting herself as the kind of cooperative citizen who respected authority and wanted to resolve the situation quickly. She wore her best dress, still modest by middle-class standards, but showing respect for the seriousness of the situation. Inspector Dubois was a thin man in his 40s with the methodical demeanor of someone accustomed to dealing with health code violations and restaurant inspections. His office smelled of disinfectant and coffee, with files stacked neatly on metal. Shelves and charts detailing bacterial contamination procedures covering one wall. "Miss Santos, thank you for coming in," he began, consulting a thick folder. "I understand you've operated your food truck in the diplomatic quarter for approximately 3 years?" "Yes, sir. I started the business after my husband passed away. It's been my only source of income." Elena let genuine emotion creep into her voice. The grief was real, even if the deceased husband was fictional. Dubois made notes on a legal pad, his pen scratching methodically. "During the week of the incident, did you notice anything unusual about your food supplies? Any changes in color, smell, or texture that might suggest contamination?" Elena shook her head earnestly. "Nothing at all, Inspector. I'm very careful about freshness because my reputation depends on quality. I throw away anything that doesn't look perfect." The questions continued for an hour, covering her suppliers, preparation methods, storage procedures, and customer interactions. Dubois was thorough but not suspicious. He was checking boxes on a standardized investigation protocol, rather than pursuing a specific theory about her involvement. "We'll need to inspect your food truck and take samples from any remaining ingredients," he explained. "It's purely routine. We're doing this with every vendor in the area." Elena had anticipated this requirement and prepared accordingly. The truck contained nothing but standard commercial food ingredients, all purchased from legitimate suppliers with proper documentation. Her preparation area was spotlessly clean, her storage properly organized, and her permits displayed prominently. The inspection team arrived at her truck the following morning too. technicians with sample collection kits, and a health official with a clipboard. Elena stood nearby as they swabbed surfaces, collected ingredient samples, and photographed every aspect of her operation. Their efficiency suggested they had done this dozens of times in recent days. "Everything looks very clean and well organized," commented the lead technician. "How often do you sanitize your preparation surfaces?" "Every 2 hours during service, and completely at the end of each day," Elena replied. "I learned food safety working in restaurants back in Barcelona." The technician nodded approvingly and made a note on his form. The inspection concluded without incident, with the team collecting their samples and promising results within a week. Elena watched them drive away, knowing that the laboratory tests would find nothing unusual because she had been far too careful to leave evidence behind. The real challenge began 3 days later when a different kind of investigator appeared at her truck during the lunch rush. Elena was serving a regular customer when she noticed a man in an expensive suit watching her operation from across the street. His posture and observation patterns immediately marked him as law enforcement or intelligence services rather than health officials. The man approached during a lull in customers, presenting credentials that identified him as Agent Thomas Mitchell from the United States Diplomatic Security Service. His presence meant that American intelligence services had connected some of the poisoning victims to sensitive diplomatic activities. "Miss Santos, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your observations during the week of the health incident," Mitchell said, his tone professionally neutral but carrying an undertone of authority that expected compliance. Elena wiped her hands on her apron, portraying the nervousness that Maria Santos would feel when confronted by American security services. "I already spoke with the health inspector, sir. I told him everything I know." "I'm sure you did. But I'm interested in different details, the people you served. Any unusual behavior you might have noticed, conversations you might have overheard." The shift in questioning focus was significant. Mitchell wasn't investigating food contamination. He was looking for intelligence about the victims' activities before they became ill. This suggested that someone in the American intelligence community suspected the incident was more than accidental food poisoning. Elena carefully modulated her responses to provide helpful but limited information. She described serving various diplomatic personnel and support staff, mentioned that some customers seemed stressed about meetings, but claimed to have no detailed knowledge about their specific activities or conversations. "These customers you mention, did any of them seem unusual in their behavior? Meet with people you hadn't seen before? Receive phone calls that agitated them?" The questions were designed to identify intelligence gathering opportunities and assess whether Elena might have witnessed pre-incident activities that could provide clues about the victim's work. She responded with the kind of vague observations that would be natural for someone who paid attention to customer service, but wasn't specifically watching for suspicious activities. Mitchell concluded the interview after 20 minutes, but his parting comment sent a warning signal through Elena's operational awareness. "We may have additional questions as our investigation develops. Please remain available for further contact." The phrase "remain available" was intelligence community language for "don't leave town." Elena understood that she was now under observation, possibly surveillance, as American security services worked to understand what had happened to their diplomatic personnel. That evening, Elena conducted a careful surveillance detection route through Geneva's Old Town, using shop windows and street reflections to identify any watchers. She spotted the surveillance team within 30 minutes, 2 agents maintaining loose coverage as she moved through the evening shopping district. Their presence confirmed that her interaction with Mitchell had elevated her from routine interview subject to person of interest. The surveillance was competent but not aggressive, suggesting they were gathering information rather than preparing for immediate action. Elena completed her route without acknowledging their presence, returning to her apartment with a clear understanding that her Operational environment had become significantly more dangerous. Over the following days, the surveillance continued, with rotating teams and varying levels of intensity. Elena maintained Maria's normal routine shopping for food truck supplies, visiting her laundromat, attending Mass at a local Catholic church while internally assessing the security implications of her situation. The most dangerous development came a week later when a woman approached her truck during the afternoon lull. She was young, professionally dressed, and carried herself with the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to authority. Her credentials identified her as Agent Sarah Chun from the Central Intelligence Agency. Miss Santos, I'm investigating the diplomatic quarter incident from a national security perspective, Chun explained, her manner more direct than Mitchell's diplomatic approach. I'd like to discuss some of the customers you served that morning. Elena's internal alarm systems activated. CIA involvement meant that American intelligence services had identified patterns in the victim selection that suggested intentional targeting rather than random food contamination. Chun wouldn't be here unless they suspected the incident was a coordinated attack. I've told the other investigators everything I remember, Elena replied, maintaining Maria's slightly overwhelmed demeanor. I just serve food to people. I don't know anything about their jobs or why they got sick. Chun produced a tablet displaying photographs of several victims. I'd like you to look at these images and tell me if you remember serving any of these individuals. The photos were surveillance shots rather than official portraits, suggesting CIA had been monitoring some of the victims before the incident. Elena recognized several faces but claimed only vague recollection of serving them, portraying the kind of limited memory that would be natural for someone who served hundreds of customers weekly. This man, Chun said, indicating Ambassador Thornfield's photograph. Do you remember any details about his order or behavior that morning? Elena's mind raced through the implications of the question. If CIA was specifically interested in Thornfield, they might know about his connection to the arms-dealing network. Her response needed to be helpful enough to avoid suspicion while providing no information that could compromise operational security. He was rude, she said finally, allowing some genuine annoyance to color her voice. Always acted like I was bothering him just by existing. Ordered the same breakfast burrito every time and complained if I took too long. Chun made notes on her tablet, then showed additional photographs. Each image represented another victim, and Elena provided similar responses: basic customer service observations without any indication that she had specifically targeted these individuals for elimination. The interview continued for 40 minutes, with Chun probing for details about timing, conversation fragments, and unusual behaviors. Elena understood that she was being assessed not just for information, but for deception indicators, speech patterns, body language, and response consistency that might suggest she was concealing important details. Miss Santos, I want to be very clear about something, Chun said as the interview concluded. If you remember any additional details, no matter how minor they might seem, it's important that you contact me immediately. This investigation has national security implications. The phrase national security implications was both a warning and a threat. Elena understood that American intelligence services were treating the incident as a potential terrorist attack or foreign intelligence operation. If they developed evidence linking Maria Santos to intentional poisoning, the consequences would extend far beyond local health code violations. After Chun departed, Elena spent the evening conducting another surveillance detection route, this time identifying 3 separate teams maintaining coverage of her movements. The surveillance pattern had evolved from information gathering to active monitoring, suggesting that her interviews had raised rather than resolved suspicions about her involvement. The situation deteriorated further when Elena discovered that investigators had begun interviewing her customers and neighbors. Mrs. Petrova, an elderly Russian woman who lived in the apartment below hers, mentioned being visited by people asking questions about Maria's habits, visitors, and activities. They wanted to know if you had friends, if anyone came to visit you, if you received packages or mail. Mrs. Petrova explained while Elena helped carry her groceries upstairs. I told them you're a quiet woman who minds her own business, but they kept asking the same questions in different ways. The neighborhood canvassing indicated that investigators were building a comprehensive profile of Maria Santos's life and activities. Elena realized that her carefully constructed identity was being subjected to the kind of detailed scrutiny that could eventually uncover inconsistencies or gaps that would expose her true nature. More concerning was the technical surveillance that began appearing around her apartment building. Elena spotted camera installations on nearby buildings and identified electronic monitoring equipment that suggested communications intercepts. Her operational environment was transforming into an active counterintelligence investigation. The breaking point came when Elena discovered that investigators had gained access to her food truck during the night. Nothing was obviously disturbed, but her professional training allowed her to recognize signs of systematic searching, items placed back slightly differently, dust patterns disturbed on surfaces, and the subtle indicators that every storage compartment had been opened and examined. The covert search represented a significant escalation in the investigation. Rather than relying on interviews and observation, investigators were now conducting active intelligence gathering operations against her. Elena understood that she was approaching the point where her cover identity would either be conclusively cleared or definitively exposed. The psychological pressure of maintaining Maria's identity under intensive investigation began taking its toll. Elena had operated under deep cover for extended periods before, but never while being actively hunted by multiple intelligence services who suspected her of mass murder. The constant performance required to maintain her character while being watched by professionals trained to detect deception demanded extraordinary mental discipline. Her apartment became a prison where every action had to be carefully calculated. She couldn't access her hidden operational materials because surveillance cameras might detect unusual activity. She couldn't alter her routine because investigators were mapping her behavior patterns. She couldn't even conduct basic counter-surveillance techniques because Maria Santos would have no reason to watch for watchers. The strain manifested in small ways that required constant management. Elena found herself speaking to imaginary conversations with her fictional husband, maintaining the emotional reality of Maria's grief even when alone. She practiced facial expressions in the bathroom mirror, ensuring that her reactions to unexpected situations would remain consistent with her character's personality and background. Sleep became elusive as Elena's mind processed threat assessments and contingency planning, while simultaneously maintaining the mental barriers that kept Maria's identity separate from Elena's operational consciousness. The psychological compartmentalization that had once been effortless now required active concentration to maintain. 3 weeks after the diplomatic quarter incident, Elena received a phone call that changed everything. The voice was unfamiliar, speaking Spanish with a Madrid accent that immediately identified the caller as someone from her past professional life. "Maria, this is Father Rodriguez from St. Anthony's Parish in Barcelona. I'm calling about arrangements for your husband's memorial mass next month." The coded message was clear. Director Mendoza was initiating emergency contact protocols, using a pre-established cover story to justify communication with Maria Santos. Elena understood that her handler had somehow learned about the investigation and was offering extraction or support. "Father, I'm not sure I can afford to travel right now," Elena replied, maintaining the conversation's religious cover while indicating her current operational status. "Things have been very difficult since the business problems started." "I understand, my child. Perhaps we can arrange assistance through the parish charity fund. Can you meet with our representative tomorrow evening? The usual place where your husband proposed?" The meeting location reference indicated a specific Geneva location that had been pre-selected for emergency contact scenarios. Elena agreed to the meeting, knowing that she would finally have an opportunity to communicate with her operational support network about the investigation's progress and her options for resolution. The following evening, Elena conducted an extensive surveillance detection route before approaching the designated meeting location, a small chapel in Geneva's Old Town where Maria Santos supposedly visited occasionally for private prayer. The location's multiple entry and exit points, limited sightlines, and natural cover for observation made it ideal for clandestine meetings. The man waiting in the chapel's back pew was not Director Mendoza, but someone Elena didn't recognize. A thin, nervous individual who looked more like an academic than an intelligence operative. His presence suggested that the Spanish intelligence services were using irregular assets to maintain contact with her, another indication of how seriously they viewed her current situation. The situation has become more complicated than anticipated, the man said quietly as Elena knelt beside him. American intelligence services have connected some of the victims to a broader investigation they've been conducting. Your operation disrupted something much larger than we realized. Elena felt a chill of understanding. The arms-dealing network she had eliminated was apparently connected to ongoing American intelligence operations. Her successful mission had inadvertently interfered with a larger investigation or operation that CIA had been conducting against the same targets. What are my options? Elena asked, maintaining the pretense of prayer while they conversed. Extraction is possible but complicated. The Americans are watching you closely, and any unusual activity could trigger immediate arrest. They need someone to blame for what happened, and Maria Santos is their primary suspect. The revelation confirmed Elena's worst fears about her operational situation. She was being positioned as the fall guy for an international incident that had killed 50 people and disrupted American intelligence operations. Whether she was guilty or innocent mattered less than the political need to resolve the case with a definitive conclusion. How long do I have? Elena asked. Days, perhaps weeks. They're building a circumstantial case based on your access, timing, and the systematic targeting of the victims. Without direct evidence, they need to construct a narrative that satisfies their superiors and allied governments. Elena understood the intelligence community's need for closure on high-profile incidents. The alternative to identifying a perpetrator was admitting that a sophisticated attack had occurred without any ability to prevent future incidents. Maria Santos provided a convenient solution, a lone wolf operative who had somehow acquired advanced poisons and targeted diplomatic personnel for unknown motivations. The handler provided Elena with updated extraction protocols and emergency communication procedures, then departed without any further discussion. Elena remained in the chapel for another 30 minutes. Processing the implications of what she had learned while maintaining the appearance of private prayer. Walking back to her apartment through Geneva's quiet evening streets, Elena felt the weight of professional isolation that defined deep cover operations. She had successfully eliminated a dangerous arms-dealing network and prevented weapons sales. That would have fueled conflicts across multiple continents. But the very success of her mission had created new dangers that threatened to destroy the carefully constructed life she had built as Maria Santos. The investigation continued to intensify over the following days. Elena noticed additional surveillance teams, more frequent technical sweeps of her apartment building, and increasing attention from local law enforcement who were clearly coordinating with international investigators. The net was tightening around Maria Santos, and Elena understood that her time for decision-making was rapidly running out. The choice facing her was stark. She could attempt extraction and abandon Maria Santos forever, leaving behind the identity and community connections she had built over 3 years. Or she could remain and face the increasing likelihood of arrest, prosecution, and imprisonment for crimes that carried life sentences in multiple jurisdictions. Either choice would end Elena Vasquez's career as an intelligence operative. The exposure of her involvement in the Geneva incident would make her too recognizable for future deep cover operations. After 2 decades of successful missions across 3 continents, she was facing the end of her professional life, regardless of how she chose to resolve her current situation. As Elena lay in her narrow bed that night, listening to the sounds of Geneva settling into sleep around her, she considered the strange irony of her position. She had spent her career protecting innocent lives by eliminating threats that conventional law enforcement couldn't reach. Now she was being hunted by the very intelligence services whose missions she had supported through her work. The woman they still called just a food truck owner had successfully completed one of the most challenging operations in modern intelligence history. But success in the shadow world of covert operations often came with consequences that extended far beyond the mission itself. Elena understood that the final chapter of her story was yet to be written, and the ending would depend on choices she would have to make in the days ahead. The decision crystallized during Elena's morning routine as she prepared coffee in her small kitchen. Through the window, she could see the surveillance team positioned across the street, their presence no longer subtle or deniable. Agent Chun had called the previous evening to schedule another interview, this time at the American consulate rather than her food truck. The location change signaled that the investigation was moving from information gathering to formal interrogation. Elena understood that accepting the consulate interview would likely result in her detention. Once inside American diplomatic territory, she would be subject to enhanced interrogation techniques and possible extraordinary rendition to facilities where Maria Santos could be held indefinitely without formal charges. The careful legal protections that governed law enforcement in Switzerland would no longer apply, but refusing the interview would be equally damaging. Maria Santos had no legitimate reason to avoid cooperating with American authorities, and any resistance would be interpreted as evidence of guilt. Elena was trapped between choices that both led to exposure and capture. The solution came to her with the sudden clarity that marked her best operational decisions. Rather than choosing between bad options, she would create a third alternative that served her mission objectives while protecting her long-term security. Maria Santos would not flee or resist arrest. Instead, she would become the victim of circumstances beyond her control. Elena spent the morning implementing a plan that drew on psychological warfare techniques she had learned during her special forces training. The key was to make the investigators believe they had discovered the truth, while actually directing them toward a conclusion that served her purposes. She began by placing a carefully crafted phone call to Agent Chun's office, using the anxious tone of someone who had remembered important information overnight. "Agent Chun, this is Maria Santos. I couldn't sleep last night because I remembered something about that morning. Something I think you should know." Chun agreed to meet at Elena's food truck within the hour, clearly eager to hear what appeared to be a voluntary disclosure of significant information. Elena used the time to prepare both her performance and the physical evidence that would support her revelation. When Chun arrived with a recording device and notebook, Elena presented herself as someone wrestling with moral obligations and personal fears. She wrung her hands, avoided direct eye contact, and spoke in the halting manner of someone revealing painful secrets. "I didn't want to say anything before because I was scared," Elena began, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "But people died, and I can't live with keeping this secret anymore." Chun leaned forward attentively, her professional instincts recognizing the body language of someone about to provide crucial information. "Take your time, Maria. Tell me what you remember." Elena's story was carefully constructed to contain enough truth to be credible while directing suspicion away from herself. She described serving a man she didn't recognize that morning, someone who had paid in cash and asked specifically about her breakfast burritos. The man had claimed to be a food blogger interested in immigrant cuisine, but his questions had seemed more focused on her customer base than her cooking. He wanted to know who my regular customers were, what times they usually came by, whether any of them had special dietary requirements. Elena continued, her voice gaining strength as she warmed to her narrative. I thought it was strange, but he seemed legitimate. He had a press credential and everything. The fictional food blogger served multiple purposes in Elena's misdirection strategy. It provided an alternative explanation for how someone might have gained detailed information about her customers and their habits. It suggested that the real perpetrator had used Maria Santos as an unwitting accomplice rather than being the primary actor. Most importantly, it gave the investigators a new suspect to pursue while portraying Maria as another victim of the plot. Chun's questions became increasingly detailed as she explored Elena's story. Where had the supposed blogger approached her? What had he looked like? Had he provided any contact information or business cards? Elena provided just enough specific details to make the story convincing, while ensuring that none of the information could lead investigators to any real individual. Did this man show particular interest in any specific customers? Chun asked, clearly trying to understand how the victims might have been selected. Elena nodded earnestly. He asked about the people in expensive suits, the ones who looked like they worked in offices rather than shops or restaurants. He said his readers were interested in how street food culture intersected with professional dining habits. The explanation provided a plausible method for victim selection while reinforcing Maria's role as an innocent source of information rather than an active participant in targeting. Elena watched Chen's expression shift from suspicion to professional excitement as the agent realized she might have uncovered the breakthrough her investigation needed. Maria, this is extremely important information. I need you to work with our sketch artist to create a detailed description of this man. Can you come to the consulate this afternoon? Elena hesitated, portraying the natural reluctance of someone who feared becoming more deeply involved in a dangerous situation. Will I be safe? If this man finds out I talked to you. Chun provided reassurances about witness protection and security measures, clearly viewing Maria's cooperation as essential to developing this new lead. Elena agreed to the consulate meeting, knowing that her performance there would determine whether her misdirection strategy succeeded or exposed her to greater danger. The American consulate in Geneva occupied a fortress-like building surrounded by security barriers and electronic surveillance equipment. Elena approached the visitor's entrance that afternoon carrying the nervousness that Maria Santos would naturally feel when entering such an intimidating environment for the first time. The security screening process was thorough but routine, with guards checking her identification and personal belongings before escorting her to a sterile conference room where Chun waited with a sketch artist and recording equipment. The setting was designed to emphasize American authority while providing a controlled environment for detailed questioning. Elena spent 3 hours working with the sketch artist to create a detailed image of her fictional food blogger. She drew on memories of dozens of real people she had encountered over the years, combining facial features and characteristics to create a composite that looked convincingly real while depicting no one who actually existed. The process required extraordinary concentration to maintain consistency in her descriptions while avoiding any details that might accidentally match a real person who could be located and questioned. Elena provided specific information about height, build, clothing, and mannerisms while ensuring that the composite would lead investigators down a pathway that could never be resolved. He had this nervous habit of checking his phone constantly, Elena told the sketch artist as they refined details of the drawing. And he wore expensive shoes that didn't match his casual clothes, like he was trying to look more relaxed than he really was. The behavioral details were designed to suggest someone operating under false pretenses while providing investigative leads that would consume significant resources without producing results. Elena understood that intelligence services would spend weeks or months attempting to identify and locate the fictional blogger, buying her time to implement her long-term escape strategy. Chun's follow-up questions focused on potential connections between the supposed blogger and the diplomatic community. Had he mentioned any specific knowledge about embassy personnel or international organizations? Did he seem familiar with diplomatic protocols or security procedures? Elena's answers suggested someone with general knowledge about Geneva's international community without indicating specific insider access. I think he might have been watching the area for several days before he approached me. Elena volunteered, providing another investigative thread for authorities to pursue. I remember seeing someone who might have been him near the embassy buildings, taking pictures like a tourist. The fictional surveillance activity would prompt investigators to review security camera footage from the diplomatic quarter, another resource-intensive effort that would produce no actionable results, while reinforcing the narrative of an unknown perpetrator conducting reconnaissance before the attack. As the interview concluded, Chen expressed satisfaction with the information Elena had provided. "This gives us our first real lead in the case," she said, reviewing her notes. "We'll be following up aggressively on this new information." Elena left the consulate with mixed feelings about her performance. The misdirection had been successful in shifting investigative focus away from Maria Santos while providing authorities with a compelling alternative theory about the attack. But the deception also committed her to maintaining this fictional narrative indefinitely, adding another layer of complexity to her already precarious situation. The immediate effect of Elena's revelation was a dramatic reduction in surveillance activity around her apartment and food truck. Investigators shifted their resources toward pursuing the fictional blogger lead, conducting interviews with other vendors, and reviewing surveillance footage in search of Elena's non-existent contact. Elena used this breathing space to implement the next phase of her escape strategy. Rather than attempting immediate extraction, which would be suspicious given her recent cooperation with authorities, she began gradually liquidating Maria Santos's life in Geneva. She contacted her equipment suppliers about selling her food truck, claiming that the stress of the investigation had convinced her to return to Barcelona. The decision to abandon her Geneva operation was portrayed as the natural response of someone traumatized by involvement in an international incident. Elena visited Maria's few acquaintances in the local community, explaining her decision to leave Switzerland and returning to her family in Spain. The narrative was consistent with Maria's established character and provided a logical exit strategy that wouldn't trigger additional investigation. Her landlord accepted her notice to vacate with understanding sympathy, commenting that the recent stress would be difficult for anyone to handle. Mrs. Petrova expressed sadness about losing her helpful neighbor but agreed that returning home was probably the wisest choice given the circumstances. Elena spent 2 weeks carefully dismantling Maria Santos's life while maintaining the appearance of someone making emotional rather than tactical decisions. She sold her furniture to second-hand dealers, closed her local bank account, and canceled her Swiss residence permits. Each action was documented and ordinary, creating a clear paper trail of someone leaving the country through normal administrative channels. The most delicate aspect of her departure preparation involved accessing her hidden operational materials without attracting attention from any residual surveillance. Elena waited for a particularly busy evening when multiple emergency vehicles were responding to an unrelated incident in her neighborhood, using the distraction to quickly retrieve her concealed documents and equipment. The emergency cache, false identification papers, and encrypted communication devices were transferred to a safety deposit box in a private banking facility that operated under Swiss financial privacy laws. Elena would need these resources for her eventual transition to a new identity, but keeping them in her apartment posed a greater risk if investigators decided to conduct additional searches. 3 weeks after her consulate interview, Elena received confirmation that the investigative focus had completely shifted to pursuing her fictional blogger. Agent Chun called to inform her that they had identified several potential matches through facial recognition databases and were conducting interviews with suspects in multiple countries. "Your information has been invaluable to our investigation," Chun explained during their final conversation. "We understand you're planning to return to Spain, which is probably wise given the stress this situation has caused. We have your contact information if we need any additional details." Elena expressed gratitude for the investigators' understanding and promised to remain available if needed. The conversation concluded with Chun's assurance that Maria Santos was no longer considered a person of interest in the case, having been reclassified as a cooperative witness whose information had redirected the investigation toward more promising leads. The official clearance of Maria Santos represented a complete victory for Alana's misdirection strategy. She had transformed herself from prime suspect to helpful witness, while providing investigators with a compelling alternative theory that would occupy their resources indefinitely. The fictional blogger would never be found because he didn't exist, but the search would continue long enough for Maria Santos to disappear completely from official attention. Elena's final week in Geneva was spent completing the administrative details of her departure while privately preparing for the most complex aspect of her transition. Rather than simply vanishing or adopting a new identity immediately, she had decided to implement a sophisticated double identity switch that would provide long-term protection against discovery. The strategy involved creating documentation that Maria Santos had indeed returned to Barcelona, where she would live quietly for several months before dying in a carefully staged accident. Meanwhile, Elena would assume a completely different identity in another European country, with no apparent connection to either Maria Santos or Elena Vasquez. The complexity of this approach required substantial resources and careful timing, but it provided the most secure long-term solution to her exposure problem. Intelligence services investigating the Geneva incident would eventually confirm that Maria Santos had returned to Spain and died in an unfortunate accident, closing her file permanently. Elena's new identity would have no connection to these events and could be maintained indefinitely without fear of discovery. Elena's last day as Maria Santos began before dawn with final preparations for her departure. She loaded her few remaining possessions into a rental car, leaving behind the modest apartment that had been her home for 3 years. The building felt hollow and impersonal without her furniture and belongings, like a movie set after filming had concluded. Her final stop was the location where she had operated Elena's kitchen for nearly 1,000 days. The food truck had been sold to another vendor who planned to continue serving the diplomatic quarter under a different name. Elena stood in the early morning darkness, looking at the space where she had served breakfast to 50 men who were now dead because of her actions. The moral weight of what she had accomplished settled around her like a familiar coat. Elena felt no regret about eliminating the arms dealers whose weapons would have fueled conflicts across multiple continents. The lives she had saved by preventing those sales far exceeded the lives she had taken to stop them. But the personal cost of the operation had been higher than anticipated, requiring her to abandon not just an identity, but an entire life she had built from nothing. Elena drove through Geneva's empty streets as the city began its daily awakening. Office workers emerged from metro stations, shop owners raised their security gates, and early commuters filled buses and streetcars. The rhythms of normal life continued around her, unaware that one of the most successful intelligence operations in recent history was concluding with a quiet departure rather than dramatic fanfare. The drive to the Swiss-French border took 40 minutes through countryside that was beginning to show signs of early spring. Elena had chosen a small border crossing that processed mostly local traffic, reducing the likelihood of enhanced scrutiny or computerized tracking of her movements. Her Maria Santos passport bore all the proper exit stamps and documentation, creating an official record of her departure from Switzerland. Once across the border, Elena began the complex process of transitioning between identities. She abandoned the rental car at a predetermined location and retrieved a different vehicle that had been positioned there weeks earlier by assets working for Spanish intelligence services. The new car contained clothing, documentation, and equipment that belonged to her temporary transition identity. Elena spent the next 6 hours driving across France, following a route that had been carefully planned to avoid electronic toll systems and automated license plate recognition cameras. Her destination was a small industrial city where she could disappear into the anonymous population of workers and immigrants while completing her transformation. The safe house was a nondescript apartment above a commercial laundry, rented through intermediaries who specialized in providing temporary accommodation for intelligence operatives in transition. Elena would remain there for several weeks while her support network created the documentation and background history for her new permanent identity. The apartment was spartanly furnished but comfortable, with basic cooking facilities and secure communication equipment that would allow her to coordinate with her handlers during the transition process. Elena felt a profound sense of relief as she closed the door behind her, finally free from the constant vigilance that had defined her last months as Maria Santos. Over the following days, Elena methodically documented her operational experiences for intelligence analysis and historical record. The Geneva operation would be studied by intelligence professionals for years to come, both as an example of successful deep cover penetration and as a case study in the challenges of long-term identity management under investigation pressure. Her operational report detailed every aspect of the mission from initial deployment through final extraction, including technical methods, psychological challenges, and lessons learned that could benefit future operations. Elena wrote with the clinical precision of a professional analyst, documenting both successes and failures with equal attention to detail. The arms-dealing network she had eliminated was confirmed destroyed through signals intelligence and human source reporting from multiple agencies. The weapons sales they had planned never materialized, preventing chemical attacks in Syria, insurgent activities in Yemen, and cartel violence in Colombia. Conservative estimates suggested that Elena's actions had prevented thousands of deaths and disrupted terrorist activities across 3 continents. But the personal cost had been significant. Elena's career as a deep cover operative was permanently ended by her exposure during the investigation. The Maria Santos identity, carefully constructed over 3 years, had been sacrificed to operational necessity. Most challenging, Elena faced the prospect of permanent exile from Spain, unable to return to her homeland because of the security risks associated with her past activities. The new identity provided by Spanish intelligence services was thorough and professionally constructed, but it represented another form of imprisonment. Elena would spend the rest of her life as someone else, unable to acknowledge her real achievements or maintain relationships that predated her latest transformation. The psychological isolation of permanent deep cover was a price that few operatives understood until they experienced it personally. 3 weeks after leaving Geneva, Elena received confirmation that Maria Santos had officially died in a traffic accident near Barcelona. The death certificate and related documentation completed her transition, ensuring that any future investigation of the Geneva incident would find only a deceased witness rather than a living operative who could be questioned or compromised. Elena's new identity as Catherine Moreau, a French translator specializing in technical documents, provided cover for a quiet life in Lyon. The identity came complete with employment history, educational credentials, and social connections that would withstand routine scrutiny while allowing her to build a new life gradually and carefully. The translation work was legitimate and provided both income and intellectual stimulation, while Elena adjusted to her new circumstances. Her linguistic skills and cultural knowledge, developed through years of international operations, made her genuinely qualified for the profession and helped establish credibility in her new community. Elena rented a small apartment in Lyons' Presqu'île district, choosing a location that was central enough to seem normal while providing multiple escape routes if her security was ever compromised. She furnished the space with second-hand items that reflected Catherine's modest income and practical lifestyle, creating another layer of authenticity for her cover identity. The adjustment to civilian life proved more challenging than Elena had anticipated. After 2 decades of high-stakes intelligence work, the routine of translation deadlines and client meetings felt surreal and disconnected from her sense of purpose. She struggled with the psychological transition from someone whose actions influenced international security to someone whose greatest daily challenge was meeting publication deadlines. But gradually, Elena began to find satisfaction in her new life's quieter rhythms. The translation work engaged her intellectually without the constant stress of operational security. Her neighbors were friendly without being intrusive, accepting Catherine as another working professional in their diverse urban community. For the first time in years, Elena could sleep without calculating threat assessments or reviewing escape routes. 6 months after leaving Geneva, Elena received her final operational communication from Spanish intelligence services. Director Mendoza's message was brief and professional, acknowledging the success of her mission while confirming that her active service was officially concluded. She was thanked for her dedication and assured of continued administrative support for her new identity, but the communication made clear that Elena Vasquez no longer existed in any official capacity. The psychological finality of that message marked Elena's complete transition from intelligence operative to private citizen. She deleted the encrypted communication software from her devices, destroyed the last physical connections to her operational past, and committed fully to building Catherine Moreau's life in Lyon. Elena found unexpected healing in the mundane activities of civilian life. She discovered genuine pleasure in cooking meals without considering their tactical applications, developed friendships without analyzing their intelligence value, and began to appreciate art and literature for their beauty rather than their operational utility. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive during decades of dangerous work gradually relaxed into normal situational awareness. A year after the Geneva incident, Elena read news reports about the continued investigation into what media outlets had labeled the diplomatic quarter poisoning. American and Swiss authorities had concluded that the attack was conducted by an unknown perpetrator who had used local food vendors as unwitting accomplices. Maria Santos was mentioned in several articles as a cooperative witness whose information had helped redirect the investigation, though her subsequent death in Spain was noted only in passing. The fictional food blogger remained the primary suspect, with international law enforcement agencies continuing their search for the mysterious individual who had allegedly gathered intelligence about diplomatic personnel before the attack. Elena felt a professional satisfaction in knowing that this investigation would continue indefinitely, consuming resources while producing no results, because its target existed only in carefully constructed testimony. But her greatest satisfaction came from intelligence reports confirming the long-term impact of her mission. The arms-dealing network she had eliminated had never reformed, despite attempts by various criminal organizations to rebuild similar operations. The disruption had been so complete that weapons trafficking patterns across multiple regions had permanently shifted, reducing the availability of advanced weapon systems to terrorist organizations and insurgent groups. Elena often thought about the 50 men she had killed during those few hours in Geneva. She felt no guilt about their deaths. They had been actively facilitating violence on a global scale, and showed no remorse for the suffering their activities caused. But she remained soberly aware of the moral weight of her actions and the responsibility that came with taking lives, even in service of a greater good. The final vindication of her mission came 2 years later when declassified intelligence reports revealed the full scope of the arms-dealing network's planned activities. The weapons sales Elena had prevented would have included chemical weapons components destined for terrorist attacks in European cities, advanced explosives for insurgent groups in Africa, and anti-aircraft missiles for drug cartels in South America. Conservative estimates suggested that preventing these sales had saved tens of thousands of lives and maintained stability in multiple volatile regions. Elena reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from elite military service to deep cover intelligence work to quiet, civilian life in Lyon. She had served her country and the broader cause of international security with distinction, achieving successes that would never be publicly acknowledged or officially recognized. The price had been high exile from her homeland, abandonment of her identity, and permanent separation from her past achievements. But as she sat in her Lyon apartment on a quiet Sunday afternoon, translating technical manuals while classical music played in the background, Elena felt a deep sense of peace about the choices she had made. The woman they had once called just a food truck owner had successfully completed one of the most challenging missions in modern intelligence history, eliminating threats that conventional law enforcement could never reach while maintaining perfect operational security throughout. The arms dealers who had mocked Maria Santos for her modest appearance and immigrant status had never realized they were facing one of Europe's most accomplished intelligence operatives. Their underestimation had been their undoing, allowing Elena to position herself at the center of their network and eliminate them with precision and efficiency that left no evidence of intentional action. In the end, Elena's greatest achievement was not just the elimination of 50 dangerous criminals, but the proof that effective intelligence work often succeeded through patience, preparation, and the careful cultivation of invisibility rather than dramatic action or technological superiority. She had demonstrated that the most powerful weapons in the intelligence arsenal were often the simplest ones: a friendly smile, a carefully prepared meal, and the universal tendency of powerful men to overlook aging women who served them food. The story of Elena Vasquez would never appear in history books or intelligence training manuals. Her achievements would remain classified for decades, known only to a small circle of professionals who understood the true scope of what she had accomplished. But the impacts of her work would resonate for generations in conflicts that never escalated, attacks that never occurred, and lives that were saved by weapons that never reached their intended destinations. Elena had spent her career protecting innocent people by eliminating threats they would never know existed. It was a form of service that required extraordinary sacrifice without expectation of recognition or reward. As she continued her quiet life in Lyon, Elena carried the satisfaction of knowing that her work had made the world measurably safer, even if that contribution would remain forever hidden from public view. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.